It's time for another polling update. So in this video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 electoral map based on current polling averages from every single state. We're going to look at all the polls that have been released between Harris and Trump to see where they stand on the path to 270. We'll begin on the West Coast with the state of Washington, where Kamala Harris leads by 11.3 percentage points based on the three polls that have been conducted between her and Trump. One of them showed Harris leading by just 5, so there definitely is some weakness for the vice president in Washington, but it's still going to be a likely Democratic state. She probably is not going to win by a solid 15-point margin. Down in Oregon, though, Harris only leads by 5%, according to the most recent Hoffman Research poll. This poll was conducted after Harris entered the race and Biden dropped out, and the vice president leading by 5 points in a state that Joe Biden carried by 16 really puts her in a bad position. So Oregon is going to fall into the lean Democratic category. And finally, California's 54 electoral votes are, of course, going to go to Kamala Harris. This is actually her home state, and she leads by 25 points, according to the only poll conducted from the Golden State so far. So California will be solid on our map. Moving on to Nevada, this is going to be one of the most competitive states in the country. Democrats have won the state in every election since 2004. That was the last time a Republican carried the silver state in a presidential election, with Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden both winning Nevada by 2.4% in 2016 and 2020. However, the state as a whole is shifting to the right. It even elected a Republican governor in 2022. Looking at the polling for 2024, Trump leads over Harris by 1.3%. He led by even larger margins when Joe Biden was still in the race, but it's clear that the former president is the favorite to flip Nevada, and so we have our first Republican state and our first flip for Donald Trump. The state of Nevada is going to be tilt Republican. Arizona is also going to be super close. This is a state that Biden actually won in 2020 by a margin of 0.3%. Today, Kamala Harris leads by a narrow 0.2% margin. This is because of a recent New York Times poll, and you do have to remember that the New York Times has always overestimated Democratic support, and looking at the polling, this is not enough for Harris to win. In 2020, Joe Biden led by 5 points in Arizona and still only won the state by 0.3, with Harris leading by 0.2, and the polls known to almost always underestimate support for Trump. Kamala Harris is not where she needs to be, but based on just the polling alone, which has always been inaccurate over the last 8 years, Kamala Harris does lead by a very narrow 0.2% margin. And in terms of margins, anything over 15 points is solid, anything from 7 to 15 is likely, any margin between 2 to 7 points is lean, and any race decided by less than 2 points will be placed into the tilt category. We're now going to move on to the states in the middle of the country. Most of them are all going to be very solid for the GOP. Looking at the state of Montana, we have Donald Trump leading on average by 15.7 points, so it's going to be a solid red state. This is the only rural state that we have polling from. Nearly all of Nebraska is, of course, going to go to the former president, while the 2nd district, we don't have it polling right now, but it's probably going to fall into the tilt GOP column. It is going to be very competitive, but Trump maintains a very slight advantage. Meanwhile, in Colorado, Kamala Harris is the favorite. She's probably going to win by around 7 to 10 points, despite Biden carrying it by 14 4 years ago. And so we don't have any polling right now between the two candidates, but we do have our first poll from New Mexico, which shows Harris leading by a 7-point margin, so it's barely going to fall into that likely Democratic category. This poll sponsored by The Telegraph. Harris leads by 7, although she's only at 44%. New Mexico is probably going to be one of those states that is surprisingly competitive this election cycle, especially as Hispanic voters continue to move away from the Democratic Party and towards the right. But for right now, based on just that one poll we have, New Mexico is going to be likely blue. Before we continue, only 12% of you guys are actually subscribed, so please take the time to subscribe right now for more content like this leading up to the election in November. And follow me on Twitter for daily political updates. Link in the description below. We're now going to look at Texas, where Republicans have carried the state in every single election since 1976. Trump is going to win it for a third time. He leads by 10 points on average in the polling. There's no doubt the former president is going to carry the Lone Star State. Its 40 electoral votes are hugely consequential for the GOP. It's going to be very hard for them to win elections without Texas, but they're not going to lose the state for at least another 20 to 30 years. And by that point, they would have flipped nearly the entirety of the Midwest. And so polling in Texas in 2020 showed that Trump was only going to win the state by 1%. Eventually, he won by nearly 6. That is just how much polls have overestimated support for Democrats and underestimated support for Donald Trump. So if Harris is leading by 0.2% or by a tilt margin in any state, she is still probably going to lose it. We're now also going to fill in Alaska and Hawaii. Alaska is obviously going to go to Trump and Hawaii to Harris. We don't have any polls from these two states yet, but they are traditionally solid states for their respective parties. Moving up now to the Midwest, this is really where we're seeing Harris start to improve a little bit off of where Biden was, but her momentum is already starting to slow down. It's already starting to fizzle out. And the next time we look at this map based on the polling, she's probably going to be in a significantly worse position than she is in right now. Voters are not happy with her economic package, and that's why Trump's odds have got up nearly 10% over just the last few days. He is now the favorite on Polymarket. And so we're going to start off in Minnesota. It's 10 electoral votes. This is the home state of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, which is, of course, Kamala Harris's running mate. And looking at the polling there, Harris leads on average by 8%. Walz is going to provide the vice president with a slight boost in a state that she really cannot lose. Now, if Joe Biden stayed in the race, Trump probably would have been able to win Minnesota. It's definitely not unrealistic. Even if Harris stays in the race, Trump has a chance, because looking at the 2016 map, Minnesota was decided by a tilt 1.5% margin. Hillary Clinton came so close to losing Minnesota 8 years ago, and honestly, Kamala Harris's quality as a candidate is very similar to that of Clinton's from 2016. And so the state of Minnesota is going to be likely blue right now, but it can definitely get more competitive. We don't actually have any polls from Iowa, but it's safe to say that the state is going to fall into the likely Republican category. Trump is going to win by a double-digit margin, probably at least by 12 points, but 15 might be a little difficult for him to overcome, considering he did win the state by just 8 points 4 years ago. But there's no doubt Iowa is going Republican for a third time in a row. Moving up to Wisconsin, the numbers right now at face value have Harris ahead. She leads by 1% at 48.6. This really is not where the vice president wants to be. Looking at polling from both 2016 and 2020 and comparing them to the actual results, what we see is that Democrats are predicted pretty well, but those undecided voters in those polls almost always fully vote for Donald Trump. I mean, just look at what we saw in 2020. Biden at 49%. That was basically what the polls suggested, but Trump was supposed to lose this state at just 42 to 43 points. But in the end, he won nearly all of the undecided voters. And in 2016, when Trump won Wisconsin, Clinton was supposed to win by around 46 to 47%, and Trump at around 43 to 44. But in the end, Trump came out on top because he won all of those undecided. And so with Harris not nearly at 50 points, she isn't really in the best position in a state like Wisconsin. She only leads by 1%. When looking at polling from 2020, Biden was already leading by 6.5 at this point 4 years ago. And looking at that final margin, he led by 6.7. So really, Biden at 51, he ended up winning 49, with Harris now at just 48. She is not in a position to win in Wisconsin. And that is why, even though the state is tilt Democratic, you honestly should not be expecting a Democratic victory in the state come November. We don't have any polling from Illinois or Indiana, but Illinois is going to be likely blue, while Indiana will be solid red. Moving up to Michigan, another highly consequential Midwestern state. If Kamala Harris loses Michigan, she is absolutely done. But looking at the polling, she does have a slight lead. She leads by 2.1%. Her lead mainly comes from this one morning consult and Bloomberg poll, which was done really, really poorly. And looking at the polling average, Michigan was close even when Biden dropped out. Harris has taken a narrow lead, but compare this to 2020, Biden led by 6.7% in August 4 years ago. So still, Harris isn't doing even close to as well as Biden is. And yes, 4 points is a lot in a state that's been decided by 0.2% and just 2% over the last two election cycles. So the Wolverine state is going to be lean Democratic, but again, this is no indication that Harris can actually win. Moving down to the Buckeye state of Ohio, Trump leads by 11.5 percentage points. The state is basically gone for Democrats. This used to be one of the states at the very center of the country. It was a bellwether, but that is no longer the case. Trump and the Republicans have completely taken over Ohio, and so the state is going to vote red, just like Iowa, for a third time in a row this November. And to finish off the Midwest, in Pennsylvania, the Keystone State is probably the most important state in the entire country. 19 electoral votes. It's mainly that high electoral vote count that gives it so much electoral importance. And looking at the polling, we see a tie between the two candidates. However, Donald Trump does still maintain a very slight lead. That's why his name is at the top. And if you look at the RCP map, Trump is still in a favored position. So it's just a rounding error that makes it a tie. And Trump also leads in that most recent Emerson College poll. And Emerson is one of the better pollsters out there. So Pennsylvania is still very slightly favoring Trump. And that is more than enough for him to win. I mean, just like in 2020, Trump was doing much worse than he is right now. Biden plus 6.4 4 years ago. Harris is not even close to where she needs to be once again. Just like in Wisconsin and Michigan, yes, she's technically leading in those states, but compared to where Clinton and Biden were in the last two elections, she is still performing a lot worse. And of course, we saw what happened. Trump outperformed expectations every single time. So Pennsylvania right now is going to fall into the tilt Republican column. We're now going to move up to the Northeast, where we have some pretty solid Democratic states. Kamala Harris is easily going to win in Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, and the District of Columbia, while both New Jersey and Delaware are going to be slightly more competitive. They're simply not as liberal, and of course, Democrats are facing issues with Bob Menendez with his scandals as a senator, and so the state is not going to be solid blue, mainly as a result of that. Up in New York, we do have a poll, though, and it shows Kamala Harris leading by 14 points. This would make the Empire State likely blue, and the first time that New York is not solid for the Democrats since 1988. It's going to be the most competitive election in New York in over 30 years, and Kamala Harris really isn't performing as well as she needs to be in a state that Biden won by 23 points just 4 years prior. New Hampshire is also going to be more competitive than it was in 2020. Kamala Harris leads by 5.7% in the state. Joe Biden won by 7.4% in the last election. Kamala Harris's lead has been shrinking as more of these polls have been conducted. And so, yes, the vice president is still the favorite in the Granite State, but you really cannot count out Trump. He came so close to winning it in 2016. In fact, New Hampshire was the second closest state in the entire country, behind only Michigan. Today, though, Harris is on track to win by a lean margin, but it's still definitely a state to watch. If New Hampshire is surprisingly close, that could be a sign for what's to come in terms of a Trump victory. Finally, completing off the Midwest, we of course have the state of Maine. It has 4 electoral votes total, and it hasn't voted red since the 1980s. The state as a whole does tend to trend slightly towards the left, and that is why Kamala Harris leads by 9 points, according to the only poll we have from the state. However, we do also have district-wide polling, because just like Nebraska, they split their electoral votes by congressional district. In the first district, Harris leads by 20 points, while in the second, Trump is up by 4. Now, these polls are going to be pretty inaccurate, because Donald Trump, every single poll before this, when he was running against Biden, it showed him leading by 15 to 20 points. In the end, Trump is probably going to win the second district of Maine by a solid margin, but based solely on just the numbers we have right now, it is going to fall into the lean Republican category, while the first district is solid blue. And to finish off the map now with just this southeastern quadrant, Kamala Harris is at 248 electoral votes, Trump at 144. But as we all know, basically almost all of the remaining states are going to go red. Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and South Carolina are all going to be safe states for the former president. We're now going to go over Virginia, where we do have a slightly competitive race. Kamala Harris leads by 5 points, according to the latest New York Times poll. And when Joe Biden was in the race, he lost the polling lead in Virginia, a state he won by 10 points just 4 years ago. Virginia has not voted Republican in a presidential election since 2004. Obama flipped it in 2008, and it's been voting blue ever since. Now, for a while, it seemed like Democrats really were vulnerable here, but with Harris replacing Biden, she does still give Democrats the advantage, and so the state is going to be lean Democratic right now, but it could get closer, especially as Harris's momentum starts to fizzle out. North Carolina is going to be another closely watched state. Democrats have been dreaming about flipping it ever since they won it for the first time in over 50 years in 2008. Obama carried North Carolina by a third of a percentage point, and Democrats thought they could win it in 2016. They lost by 3.7. They thought they really could win it in 2020 because Joe Biden led in North Carolina polling throughout the entirety of the election cycle 4 years ago, but in the end, he still lost by 1.3%. Democrats have only won the Tar Heel state once since Jimmy Carter in 1976, and of course, that was Obama in 2008. And looking at the polling between Harris and Trump here, Donald Trump leads by 1.2%. This basically means he's going to win by at least 3 to 4, because in 2020, there was not a single point in time where Trump was ever ahead in the polling average in North Carolina, but he still somehow came out on top. That's what he's done in basically every single state. He was behind in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia in 2016. He was supposed to lose all of those states, but he ended up winning nearly every single one. And so looking at North Carolina right now, it's going to be tilt Republican, but there's no doubt Trump is on track to winning the state for a third time in a row. Georgia is also going to be very closely watched. And again, just like Arizona, Wisconsin, Kamala Harris is probably not going to win these states just because of how close they were in 2020. When Democrats were in an unbelievably favorable position in 2020, it was during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. The economy wasn't doing too great during the pandemic, and of course, Trump was in office for 4 years, and being in office for that long really does hurt your popularity. And so even among those circumstances, Joe Biden only carried Georgia by 0.2, Arizona by 0.3, Wisconsin by 0.6, and Pennsylvania by 1.2. Now that Trump is significantly more popular than he was 4 years ago, it's not going to be too difficult for him to win states he lost by such small margins, and Georgia is definitely one of them. In fact, this is probably his most likely flip on the map. Trump leads by 1% in the polls, although only one singular poll has Harris ahead. There's no doubt the Peach State is going to vote for Trump for a second time, despite him not winning it 4 years ago. Georgia's going to be tilt Republican as well, with the former president as the favorite. And finally, in Florida, this used to be a hyper-competitive swing state. Florida was almost always the most polled state in the entire country just because of how important it was. Joe Biden was supposed to win Florida. He led in the state throughout the entirety of the 2020 election cycle, but the opposite happened. Trump won by 3.4%. In fact, he did better than he did in 2016 when Florida was still tilt red. And in just the last 4 years, the state has probably shifted 5 to 10 points to the right. Marco Rubio and Ron DeSantis won their re-elections in Florida by 16 and 19 points respectively. Solid margins in Florida were almost unheard of over the last 30 years, and so Florida truly is no longer a swing state. I mean, just look at the list of battleground states. You won't see Florida anywhere. The state is not being polled nearly as much as it was in the past. Trump leads by 6.3%. Right now, it's going to be lean Republican, but he can probably come out with a likely margin of victory come November. And so with Kamala Harris's momentum slowing down, the 2024 electoral map is looking like it's still going to be a victory for Donald Trump. He is on track to carry 277 electoral votes. Kamala Harris at 261. Yes, Harris has improved off of Biden's performance, but we're probably going to see her start to slip in the polls in the coming weeks. And of course, we'll keep you updated here. So thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this leading up to the election in November. And join my Discord server, link in the description below.